Namaste and good evening, everyone. Namaste, Sraddhalu.
Namaste and happy to be with all of you.
We are happy to continue today part 6 on the same topics, dreams, visions, out-of-body experiences, and with much further guidance that we received from the Mother and Sri Aurobindo on this topic of exteriorization. And you may post questions beforehand or during our conversation in our YouTube chat box, and by sending in emails at integralstudies.in@gmail.com. And I will start with a repeat of last time's question from the nickname Buzz. He's asking, can these states, dreams, samadhi be induced? Does this need prior preparation or any readiness?
Yes. So I had given a somewhat detailed reply to this question already last time. But there was one little bit which was missing, which I think is actually very significant. So I thought it important enough to add it now that we complete that topic. You will recall Buzz's question about states of samadhi or generally any spiritual experience. Can it be induced? And if there is a prior preparation or readiness required, I had said it can be induced directly by the inner being, and I gave the example of Ramana Maharshi, where already something was ready at the inner level which was pushed to the surface. But I also spoke of induction by an external space. I gave certain examples, for example, a certain cave in Rishikesh and my experience there, or the induction by external person. And we discussed some of the issues around that, particularly when you are taken into deeper or higher states of consciousness. There's only up to a point where you are able to retain your conscious awareness, after which it begins to fade, or even that you cannot be taken further because there's nothing left of your substance or your development in those levels that would allow you to remain in that state. And this was broadly what I had said regarding the induction from an external person. And then I had highlighted how your sensitivity, receptivity, ability to retain and recall the memory, etc., all of these would make a big difference. But there's a fine point. It's fine, but it's extremely important, which was missed. And so I want to highlight this. I said you cannot go into deeper or higher states beyond a point if there has not been a prior preparation or readiness. But if this was all, then the preparation or readiness would be necessarily too slow an affair. There is in fact a deeper truth to this. I said you cannot, for example, enter a higher state if the substance on that state is not yet sufficiently formed, developed, individualized. We'll see more about that perhaps today and further. But what can happen is you may not have developed the substance, but the person who is imprinting the experience may have that developed substance and can infuse it into you. Now this is extremely important because it is one of the most rapid ways by which we can grow into deeper and higher states of consciousness. Because you don't have the substance, for you to build that, for you to individualize in that level, etc., might be too long, too slow a process. And if all of our yoga depended on just that, it would take far too long. But if that substance can be infused into you from the divine directly, from the divine mother directly, or through an external agency of a person or even a space where that substance is strong, then you can actually find within you the capacity to enter those higher or deeper gradations as if that substance were your own, and experience those things. Having had that experience or having retained something of the substance given to you, you could actually build your inner and higher ranges of consciousness, individualize, organize them, etc. So this is a very fine point, that you can be given the substance which was lacking. But it is also the most important point because it is by such a means that the sadhana can be enormously accelerated. It takes place in two ways. One is when you may be sufficiently receptive and the one who gives, the Divine Mother, or let's say a human being who has attained to that experience or has reasonably stabilized in it, chooses now to infuse the substance along with the experience. Pulls you into the state, but also infusing the substance. So there is at that point literally substantiality of that person's consciousness or the Divine Mother, which is actually filling you, joining with you, becoming yours, given to you, and lifting you into an experience. On the other side, you could turn to being in a receptive state, but also while turning, identify with something of that consciousness by process of concentration, identify and thereby unite with that consciousness, with that substance, and thus enter into an experience. I want to give a very specific example here of the person that the mother used for creating some of her mystical and spiritual paintings. That is Huta Hindocha. Huta was the name that the mother gave her. And she literally trained her from zero. She had no capacity of painting, no experience, perhaps an innate capacity, but nothing trained formally on the surface. And mother trained her from scratch, taught her everything from basics of cleaning and preparing the brushes and materials to strokes and colors and so on. All the way through. And you can see some of her earlier paintings have a certain lack of skill, and then as she grows rapidly, because the mother is infusing into her literally the capacity but also her substance of her consciousness. And then when the mother prepared her sufficiently, she began with her a series of paintings, first with some of Sri Aurobindo's poems, and then the magnum opus, which was the paintings from Savitri. Taking lines from Savitri, she had Huta paint. Mother would herself do a rough sketch and then have Huta do the filling. Mother would indicate the colors. And increasingly, as Huta's capacity grew, Mother would give less and less in terms of detailing of instruction and more of the infusion directly of the inspiration. And what the mother envisioned, she would transmit, and Huta would receive and become a transparent instrument for this, with hardly a few external suggestions to direct her. So it's an extraordinary work that she did in building her capacity. But here you must understand, it's not just a skill capacity, it's also a consciousness capacity. It's also a skill of consciousness which is being infused. She is being lifted up into a level, but also this infusion of substance, building her literally. Come to something very important here. At some point, as the higher worlds were being described, the mother wanted Huta to experience them so that the content of the experience would come into the paintings. Because after all, a true painting or a poem or any communication which is inspired is only as valuable as the content of experience that it can transmit. It's not the same thing as reading a book and doing a picture. Oh, it must be like this, so I will imagine and create. It does not have the same force. When you receive from an experience and transmit into form in any of these means, the content of the experience transmitted, even if the form is imperfect, the force will be felt. She wanted Huta to do this for those experiences. And I've narrated before a few of these, but just to touch upon two of them, on the matter of drawing with Savitri meeting the god of death. Mother said, well, you have to meet the god of death. So she actually said, tonight I'll send you the god of death. And Huta narrates how she had this being come into her room, walk around, she felt the whole thing, etc. But that's not the point. The point still is, on those worlds, and as she had to draw those worlds, Mother said, you have to experience this. So she would take her into those worlds at night, leave her there or lead her there with the experiences that she came back with, and then paint with the full freshness of the impact of that experience. So there were some fascinating ones where Huta said she was taken to some huge room, and there were these little beings, almost like little children. They were holding by the hand and said, "Come with us, we'll show you." And there was this huge room where there were human heads on the wall. The way human beings put animal heads that they have hunted, stuff them and then hang them on the wall. Well, they were human heads. And then she was brought to a place in the wall and said, "There's a little hole here, put your whole head inside, put your head." And Huta said, "No, I will not do anything without the mother's permission." Instinctively, because that was the deep truth of her being. And afterwards, when she narrated to the mother, mother said, "Yes, if you had put your head, you would have been stuck there and it would be a trophy for them." It was one of the examples of what she narrated as a dangerous one. And she said another one where they kept saying, "Just agree to stay on. Please tell us you will stay. Please accept to stay on." And she said, "No, I will not do anything without mother's permission." And mother said, "Yes, if you had said, yes, I will stay on, then you would have been stuck there." Of course, the mother had the capacity to pull her out. That would not have been such a serious issue, but the nature of those spaces and dangerous spaces of the lower vital worlds and even higher vital worlds that she was taken to. But the most important, at some point, the mother took her into the supramental world. And I had the good fortune to hear Huta narrating, although in brief. I think she has written extensively about these in her Story of a Soul, which appeared in the Mother India and which is yet to come out in book form. But in that she narrates how she found herself in this world, the mother has taken her there, and she sees the supramental world, the supramental beings. Everything is golden hued, translucent, and so on. But she finds herself floating. And at some point she wanted to come down and settle on the ground. And she couldn't. And the mother said, I think it was after, I don't know exactly when, the mother said to her that you will be able to do only when you reach that consciousness. So here's a very subtle point. The mother could take her to a grade of consciousness which she had not developed yet. How? As I said, you can't enter a domain where your own consciousness has no affinity with. But by infusing the mother's own consciousness into her, she builds as if a kind of a bridge, a continuum in Huta's consciousness, with which and in which then she can easily rise and have an experience. On returning, if she has the capacity to receive, to hold, and makes the effort to retain, as if in time some part of that capacity or the imprint of that consciousness or even the substantiality of it can remain in her, and if not frittered out, would become as if a groove along which she could easily rise and rapidly grow, even without further infusion or help. But if, on return, there is no effort to retain, to continue, and the consciousness is dispersed, all that was received rapidly is as if dissolved, frittered away, thrown out, dispersed. And then suddenly, not only the experience is gone, but the memory of the experience fades out. And again, I can say this from experience. It's as if a person has had an experience, a few days down, oh yeah, that I remember now, but it's fading out. And if at that point they've written it, it's like a dream that you have remembered, but it's still vivid now. A few days down, it's a little faded. You can read it and say, ah yes, now I remember. A few weeks or a month down, the person looks at the text and says, I don't even remember having written it. What experience was that? I don't remember. And that's it. It's gone. Because the substance in which the content was held in a higher grade has been totally dispersed. If some of it had been integrated, a little bit at least of the memory would remain, but something was totally lost. But remember always, a groove once built, it means one can always more easily return, etc. But this infusion I'm pointing to because it is something extremely important in the way the integral yoga was practiced in the early stages of the sadhana in the ashram. And it was for this reason that at that point the necessity of celibacy was so important, because with any experience of throwing out of consciousness, as normally happens in a sexual experience, all of this substance, everything gathered, received, densified, would be also thrown out. And the result would be the loss of all the work done upon the sadhaka by Sri Aurobindo and the mother, by this constant daily infusion of dense substantiality of the spiritual consciousness. Therefore, it was a requirement. This requirement later was loosened when the families came, many of them with children as well as living a family life, becoming a part of the collective consciousness of the ashram, diluting it in the process, but also not conforming to the requirement of holding that intensity, and the result was a dissipation, weakening of the presence. The mother used it for various other objectives, but the point was, not everybody then would have the capacity or the ability or even the interest to receive and hold something of a much higher, more intense density. That being the case, the mother had to necessarily withdraw and shift the means of the action. She said till then numbers were smaller and she was doing the sadhana, you just had to remain open. A similar thing we find in the narration of some of the early sadhakas who were with Sri Aurobindo, and they said they would play football most of the day, eat food, play, have fun, not doing much really. And the only requirement was that they remain constantly open to Sri Aurobindo in some part of the consciousness, and the other was celibacy, which was obviously because what was being infused into them would be otherwise dispersed. But when that is contained, he could build, and each time renewing the intensity and intensifying, densifying the atmosphere, the presence, the substance, until they found themselves literally lifted into higher and more intense states of consciousness and having all those experiences. One of those is the narration of one person by the name of Kodanda Rama Rao, a very interesting book. I've often quoted from that, but subsequently at some stage he left the ashram. Of course, the imprint once received is never lost, but the density he had obviously was then gradually lost, depleted, and depending on the life that he followed, it was brought down to whatever level of dilution that he was able to contain. This I wanted to complete as far as that discussion was concerned about induction of an experience. And it means that if you have a little bit of opening and receptivity, not only an experience that you are ready for, but also things you are not at all ready for can be infused into you, because the substance and consciousness necessary to reach those experiences can be infused into you. And if then you are able to hold on to that literally and build on that consciously, you can have a rapidity and acceleration of sadhana which is unimaginable. Such was the method used in the early days of the sadhana, which Sri Aurobindo and the mother literally did in the sadhaka by such means. Such is still the method that is available to us if we can in this similar way open ourselves to the direct action of the Divine Mother and to the atmosphere of the dense presence and atmosphere that can be built up as she has built around in the ashram, around the samadhi, or as we find in other spaces, and I found this in certain centers, not all of them, but in some of them, where the presence is cherished and the quality and purity of consciousness protected. And I remember once going to Orissa to one of the centers, and it was just after the tsunami had washed a lot of things in that and damaged a lot of things. And on being taken to that center, the organizers there told me that when Panditji MP Pandit, my teacher, had gone there, he had commented that the density of the presence was as strong as in Sri Aurobindo's room. Now they have built it in this form of a samadhi, similar to the samadhi in Pondicherry, with Sri Aurobindo's relics, nails or hair inside. And hearing this must have been in the late 1990s. So hearing this, and by then it must have been at least 25 years since MP Pandit had visited the place, I said to myself, well, it's been a long time, I'm sure it's diluted. And I assumed it would be a diluted presence, because, modern world and so on. But on going there, on reaching that spot, it was literally the same experience, the same density as in Sri Aurobindo's room. Now I will ascribe the maintenance of this density to the people who looked after the space. And I have had the opposite experience of being taken to a place where there was complete neglect of the presence, and you could feel the presence waiting, as if in a potential, waiting for people to value and to invite it to fully spread out and unfold, but then just waiting. And outside it was thinned out, but inside, as if in a seed, it was still waiting. So a lot depends on the environment and the space that we build to contain, literally like a container. You have to have a boundary protecting. Within the boundary, you have to allow the presence to densify and intensify, deepen, heighten, etc. And then people who come into that space will find themselves as if lifted, and the induction of the experience, to the extent they are ready for or open or receptive, etc. But it is also equally possible that somebody brings a contrary vibration and dilutes or weakens, and so the necessity of protection of such a space. I think with these comments, I would feel satisfied that I have completed that particular question and the implications of that. Now, to continue with our topic, which has been so far about dreams, visions, exteriorizations, out-of-body experience, and now we are moving more and more towards out-of-body experience, I want to take up some texts from Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. And you have, of course, many wonderful stories from the Mother. Let me just quickly look at the chat box. There are many questions from before which we will keep for next time, but there's some comment of Geminus where he says, developing the subtle physical will hold the journey memory for a long time. The subtle physical body needs to be strengthened, made dense and supple, so the journey memory can be withheld in the waking state. And yes, this is very true. And that's why what I'm speaking of, the density, is the density of the spiritual consciousness densified to a gradation which is almost material. And at that point, the container is subtle physical. And similarly, in our own body, the bridge between our surface physical consciousness and all of the inner and higher ranges, the linking layer is the subtle physical. So I'm taking this observation of Geminus as very important. It's part of the work we will have to do to build our inner capacity, both for the spiritual purpose as well as if you choose to have the experiences out of body. And we'll find texts of the Mother where she describes all this. So my objective now to proceed further was to take up texts of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. As I said, there are wonderful stories, narrations of the Mother, of her own experiences and experiences of in Tlemcen, when she was working with and studying under the occultists Monsieur and Madame Théon, and particularly with Madame Théon, who was far more accomplished in these respects. There are lots of wonderful stories. All of these are illuminating and indicative of various possibilities as well as preparatory needs. And I choose to avoid some of the more superficial ones right now and focus on some of the incidents which narrate but also elucidate. And along with a text of Sri Aurobindo which is far more detailed, which describes the subtle worlds, our relation with them, and what is possible. So I'm going to read from two of these passages. First, beginning with something of the mother, where she tells you what is the requirement to be able to have such an experience out of the body. This is from a text dated November 4th, 1958, in Conversations of the Mother, Words of the Mother, Volume 3, where somebody asks, do the gods of the Puranas and gods of the Greek and Egyptian mythology have any real existence? I believe I have read this text before, a couple of years ago perhaps, but now in a different context and with a different selection of portions. She says, yes, of course they have, but it's a huge and interesting field of study. But then she takes a deeper understanding of this whole thing. She says that there are beings. She describes their basis, their emergence. I think we had discussed this before, so I won't go into that. But then she says, according to traditions and occult schools, all these zones of realities, these planes of realities have got different names. They have been classified in a different way. But there is an essential analogy, and if you go back far enough into the traditions, you see only the words changing according to the country and the language. Even now, the experiences of Western occultists and those of Eastern occultists offer great similarities. But why shouldn't it be identical? And she will explain later that if you have studied something about these things, that already adds a coloring. So the fact that you belong to a tradition and you have read text or books or other people's experiences of these worlds, it already adds a coloring to your experience. And that's why strong similarities but colorings according to traditions or lineages you belong to. All who set out on the discovery of these invisible worlds and make a report of what they saw give a very similar description, whether they be from here or there. They use different words, but the experience is very similar and the handling of forces is the same. You see, description is similar, but handling of forces is the same. Meaning the reality is the same, but your perception of it, because of your expectation or prior conditioning, can be slightly different. The knowledge of the occult worlds is based on the existence of subtle bodies and of subtle worlds corresponding to those bodies. Now, the perspective is from the individual outward. We have gradations of subtle bodies, and of course there are worlds corresponding to them. The same question you could take from outside in. Cosmos has so many gradations, and therefore if we do not have yet, we should eventually be able to have equivalent bodies or gradations of consciousness organized in us as a miniature cosmos, right? So evolution basically boils down to this, that we don't have all these, but as we grow into all these and develop subtler gradations of bodies corresponding to these worlds, we end up as an individual evolving to the corresponding grade of consciousness while embedded in the physical body. And that's why we have evolution. Otherwise, you step out of the physical body, you live in that plane. You shift to another plane, you live in that plane. Evolution happens because the physical consciousness is now being given powers and capacities corresponding to those planes, but by the formation of these bodies, as if infused, layered, densifying. So this is very important, and it corresponds to what we just discussed earlier about substance being infused. So literally, I will digress, but it's worth understanding this. You take a dog or an ape which has a sufficiently matured consciousness that it's close enough to the intelligence of the human, but not in the human domain of intelligence. And at that point, the owner of the dog or the ape, out of love, caring for the dog, pours himself with his love, his substance, his consciousness into the dog. You will see the dog, when it comes to you, or a cat, looks at you like this, as if you are their God, and is so open and receptive. Not all are, but those who are at least, they are like this, open and receptive to you, not to everyone else. And when the owner similarly now gives affection and love and infuses consciousness, there is literally this imprinting process taking place, not of higher grades of consciousness, but of that which is formed in the owner, which is generally some part of the mental vital. That infusion takes place. Now, if the owner is very developed in conscious awareness of the intellectual layers, something of that also infuses. If the owner is much more in the sentimental, emotional, vital, with a touch of mind, well, that's the layer that's infusing. As a result, the dog, cat, or other pet acquires more and more the imprint of consciousness of the owner. Literally is building that grade of substance of consciousness, rising to the grade equivalent to the owner's primary grade of consciousness, which may not be very high intellectually. But if it is, then you have also infused an intelligence into the dog and a capacity for intelligence that was not present before and is not formed by a natural evolution but by an infusion of this kind. As a result, this dog might acquire an ability literally to think as the human does, with the only difference being that they cannot speak. But other than that, through eyes, through communication, through gesture, being able to communicate something very complex. If now you give them a means to articulate with words, then you'll find the dog communicating with the same skill and complexity as a human being. There's a very good example of this. On YouTube, there's a channel called, I think it's called What About Benny? It's a dog which has been given a vocabulary of nearly 50 words through buttons with the words and the meanings taught by association over time. And now you find this dog able to convey complex ideas, sentences, emotions in a way which is human. Sometimes warning the owner that the milk is boiling over or things like that. But using a vocabulary that's limited to those 50 words. And that's quite fascinating how that works. Those of you who are interested can explore that. And similarly, we know of this ape called Coco, which had built a vocabulary of 2000 words and could convey complex emotions and ideas. So a lot of this happened by the infusion of the human being's mind. And so if that human being who's doing this could do it consciously, one could actually accelerate the process. If the dog is open and receptive and consciously aspiring, there's so much more that can happen. So I have often compared this state of the dog with the human, with us who are, I will say, aspiring candidates for the supramental evolution, and at present, as far away from the supramental consciousness as the dogs are from the human consciousness, or more perhaps. And so we are like that, looking to the Divine Mother and say, here, fill me. And if we genuinely do this with a certain openness and receptivity and whatever is required, and she always will infuse, then that whole process can be enormously accelerated. So I've digressed a little bit, but you come back to this text where he says, existence, where she says, existence of subtle bodies and subtle worlds corresponding to those bodies. Putting it from the human perspective, if you don't have that body, you don't have access to that world. But if within your own finer gradations of consciousness, a little bit of the substance has been developed, you have access. And then if there is the infusion from above, from the Divine Mother, or from a help from somebody else who has that and the capacity to transmit, you can actually open out and have an experience of those things and then come back, losing, retaining, depending on your effort and capacity. But still you recognize there's some requirement that you should have something formed on those layers to be able to explore those worlds. So they are what the psychological method calls states of consciousness. Now this is a big problem with modern psychology, where everything is reduced to states of consciousness, and then of course all states are reduced to brain waves or brain functions. So in the mother's comment, she puts states of consciousness in quote marks. Actually, they are not just states of consciousness, they are substantial layers of consciousness or subtle gradations of bodies which are ours. And the states correspond to the gradations of consciousness or the gradations of the bodies. And so she says, but these states of consciousness really correspond to worlds. So in principle, as many worlds, so many gradations, so many states. And the rest is then a question of evolution and integration across these. So, we continue with the text. The occult procedure consists then in being aware of these various inner states of being or subtle bodies, and in becoming sufficiently a master of them so as to be able to go out of them successively, one after another. Very simply stated, occult procedure as distinct from a spiritual process, which might be much more direct, much more complete, but with a different focus. But in the occult procedure, you want to master each of these grades first. So, you become aware of these various inner states of being or subtle bodies, and in becoming sufficiently a master of them so as to be able to go out of them successively. So, you have to go successively because in order to get to a higher, you should pass through an intermediate. And if you cannot pass through the intermediate and hold your own in the intermediate, you can't go to something higher, at least in the occult procedure. And so you become conscious of a state until you're sufficiently mastered that you're able to go out fully in that state. Then from there you can find to a still finer grade and go out in that state, and so on. Why is this important? The full scope of this we will understand when we will see a text of the mother where she says she could go out in 12 bodies. But right now the goal is not even to go out, is to become conscious in the subtle body. What does that even mean? So if you say I am conscious, when you say I am just conscious, what you mean by that is I am conscious of awareness in my body and identified with my body. If at this moment your consciousness is separated from your physical body, you will start receiving a kind of a vertigo. You'll find yourself floating, drifting as if, and you'll say, now I am becoming unconscious. No, actually what has happened is you've become more conscious in your subtle body, separate from your gross physical body. That you call unconscious, and you quickly slap back in identification with the physical body. This is our habit. This is the great problem for anyone who wants to become conscious in the subtle bodies. So get this idea clear, and then you will find so much more is possible. But in fact, as a first step, you will find that a transition out into a subtler gradation will involve as if feeling this floating lightheadedness, etc., which is typically what happens when you're in deep concentration or meditation, inward, upward, whatever direction it takes. But because your eyes are closed, you are not always so aware. But also, in most cases, people are still bound in the physical body. If you fully identify with a subtler layer, to the point where you lose awareness of the physical, that's when you will find, it feels like I'm so light, it feels like I could be floating, it feels like, well, many things, which correspond to that grade of consciousness. Often, one has an experience in concentration or meditation that you feel as if you're light, weightless, floating, or even sometimes you feel as if you're drifting, similar to the state when you're falling asleep. So many people at that point say, I think I'm falling asleep, and you snap back to identify with the physical. Don't make that mistake. So one of the skills required if you want to follow this occult procedure is to be aware of these inner layers in themselves until you can become sufficiently master of them as to be able to separate now fully from the physical. So specific processes and much more simple and direct processes for having out-of-body experiences we will be discussing another time. But right now let's understand the full technology involved in mastering what is available to us in an evolutionary unfolding. Now I said this is an occult, the mother calls it occult procedure, and I said this is limited to the occult process. What would be the distinction with the spiritual? I'm again digressing from the text, but it's useful to understand. In the spiritual process, one need not necessarily go step by step through all these levels. One would directly focus upon a deeper and higher state of consciousness, attain to some degree of stabilization of that and the experience associated with that, and then from there, as if build continuity or awareness of the intermediate levels, or from a deeper state, build awareness of intermediate layers all the way to the physical. What's the benefit of this? You've already got to something which is far more capable, more free, more true, more real, and as a consciousness which is far greater. And with that greater awakened consciousness, you work to awaken consciousness of the lesser gradations. Much more easy to do, much more rapid in results, much more complete in results than starting with your existing insufficient capacity and trying to build slowly, which would be the occult procedure. So the spiritual process can bypass all this and just focus on something deeper, becoming conscious, for example, of your psychic being, becoming conscious of a higher above mind state of opening more and more to an intuitive, without necessarily developing into intermediate gradations. Let me give another example. You could, for example, if you follow the normal evolution, work to develop and master your intellect as an intermediate level, and then only move to a higher mind of light or intuitive consciousness, or higher mind first and then mind of light or intuitive consciousness. But develop and master the intellect fully. That could take a lifetime or a few lifetimes if you really want to stabilize it as part of your evolutionary grade. Or, as happens to so many of us, we don't have the intelligence sufficiently developed. We look at people who are super smart and we say, wow, I wish I had that. But instead you bypass all this, open to the intuitive consciousness, receive the intuitive influx into your mind, and then as needed you will find your intelligence, led by the intuition, operating with amazing insight and brilliance, competing even with those smartest people that you used to think, maybe not necessarily with the same ease or practice of vocabulary, which also may grow eventually, but at least in comprehension and articulation. And this is a good example of what you see in Ramakrishna Paramahansa. Because of the intuitive development, he could give answers to complex philosophical questions with simple analogies or examples drawn from the domain of the life that he lived in, which was very simple. But the ability to understand also those complex philosophical questions. But you have not consciously passed through the level of development of the intellect in itself. Now, does it matter? Depends on your priority. If your intellect has been sufficiently developed and then you open to the intuition is a more powerful instrument through which to act with a higher knowledge. If your intellect has not been sufficiently developed, the intuition will still act through the instrument and raise its power of intelligence, but only to such a degree as it is able to in its current stage. And that could happen further across a few lives to perfect it or not. And you may think, oh, why do I want to waste time with the intellect when I have something far more powerful as an instrument of knowledge? This is exactly what happened in the previous cycle in the Vedic period, and Sri Aurobindo relates to this, saying that there was a touch of the intuitive consciousness, but the intellect not being developed sufficiently, it had to fall back, work on rebuilding this, and then reopen to the intuition through this. So, all this is to give a background of the difference between the occult procedure and the spiritual process, by which you may gain to something equivalent to the occult, may not have the same degree of mastery, but sometimes with a far greater power, force, rapidity and fullness than any occult procedure would give you. Any occult procedure would be limited to what you've been able to develop and the means by which you've been able to develop it, but sometimes with great precision within those means. Again, to compare, there was this person who was called Panditji from Rameshwaram, Nilkant Shastri, who at some point had come to the mother and found in her, saw in her the Divine Mother. But he came from such a background of occult knowledge and the tantric way. Satprem was fascinated by him and wanted, and many other people were interested in all that. And he did certain pujas to help the mother. And the place where he did the puja is now called Puja House. When he did the pujas, the mother said, when he summoned the goddess, she came with her whole army. And mother said, when I summoned the goddess, she came alone. Of course, the mother could have summoned her with the army. That's not the point. But in the nature of the process, the technology of the occult process was a particular outcome, but it was limited to that. It was not this man's power. It was the result of the process. But this man, so to say, held the benefit of the power. The result was, at some point, there was the arrogance that came with the expansion of the ego. And he wanted to then impose himself on the mother and did certain things which, on an occult level, the mother did not appreciate also. And at some point, she had to allow for some distance to form. But it was limited to an occult process with its very specific power and capacity, but stuck within that box. And so I'm highlighting this. I'm sorry I'm digressing from the text, but it's extremely important. When the mother makes a passing comment, the occult procedure consists. Yes, you must understand how this is different from the spiritual procedure. But then she says, becoming aware of these various inner states of being or subtle bodies. You want to become aware. And in becoming sufficiently master of them so as to be able to go out of them successively, one after another. There is indeed a whole scale of subtleties, increasing or decreasing according to the direction in which you go. Subtleties increasing or decreasing as you come down. And the occult procedure consists in going out of a denser body into a subtler body, and from that denser to another subtle, and so on again, up to the most ethereal regions. You go by successive exteriorizations into bodies or worlds more and more subtle. It is somewhat as if every time you passed into another dimension. Somewhat as if. It's not the same, but corresponds to some mental idea we have here. Then she said the fourth dimension of the physicists is nothing but the scientific transcription of an occult knowledge. To give another image, one can say that the physical body is at the center. It is the most material, the densest, and also the smallest. And the inner bodies, more subtle, overflow more and more the central physical body. They pass through it, extending themselves farther and farther, like water evaporating from a porous vase and forming a kind of steam all around. And the greater the subtlety, the more the extension tends to unite with that of the universe. One ends up by universalizing oneself. So as you go up the scale of gradations finer and finer, your consciousness naturally is more vast, more free, more extended, more one with all things. So in the lecture which Mark Oborn had, which will be shortly put up, one of the things he did as an exercise was, he said, imagine as if you were everywhere in the room and inside everybody, and everybody was a part of yourself. And why he did this was to familiarize yourself with the feeling of what it's like when you are out of the body. In contrast, our sense of I am conscious is so narrow bound and rigidly restricted that when you start moving into a grade of consciousness which widens out, your first impression is to think, oh, I am dissipating, thinning out, losing myself, I am not me anymore, and you shrink back. I'm highlighting these things because for those of you who are interested in actually both spiritual development as well as the occult development, to become conscious to not make these mistakes is extremely important. It can happen because, well, somebody infused the experience into you, you had that experience, you say, oh, that's what it's like. You come back to your narrowness and then you crave the wideness. But if that has not happened and you have gone progressively into a deeper and wider consciousness, the first thing you say is, oh, I think I'm losing myself, I'm losing my body, I'm losing my awareness, I might be beginning to fall asleep, and you instinctively shrink back to the narrow. Don't. Accept this as a normal process. As long as you are aware, even if you think you're sleeping, you're aware, well, you're not sleeping, you're in a different grade. But it's not an out-of-body state. Don't confuse the two. But it can be an inner or higher state of consciousness. Observe, get used to it. One of the things which I find necessary to remind people when they have first these kinds of widening experiences or losing of boundary, etc., they will say, oh, I think I fell asleep, I was not conscious, oh, I think I was lost somewhere in something. I ask, were you conscious that you were lost in something? Yes. No, then you were not lost. You were conscious in a different, wider, freer, lighter, higher, deeper, whatever grade of consciousness. And that grade is like this. It is boundaryless. It is vast. It is wide. It is light. In relation to the gross body's heaviness, it is free and light. Accept it, get used to it. Even train yourself to be able to consciously re-enter that state and come back and re-enter, and then infuse bit by bit something of that all the way into your waking consciousness, so that within your body, with identification of your physical body, you can have this wide, free, light, large consciousness. And you will walk on the road and you will feel as if everything around you is within you when this has been done. But that's how it is initially. So get used to it rather. So she's using this analogy of a vapor. And the greater the subtlety, the more the extension tends to unite with that of the universe. One ends up universalizing oneself. And it is altogether a concrete process which gives an objective experience of invisible worlds and even enables one to act in these worlds. I'm skipping portions. All these regions, all these domains are filled with beings who exist, each in its own domain. And if you are awake and conscious on a particular plane, for example, if on going out of a more material body, you awake on some higher plane, you have the same relation with the things and people of that plane as you had with the things and people of the material plane. That is to say, there exists an entirely objective relation that has nothing to do with the idea you may have of these things. Naturally, the resemblance is greater and greater as you approach the physical world. Obviously, resemblance to the physical world will be greater. You move away, the resemblance is different. And even the material world, and even there comes a time when the one region has a direct action upon the other. In any case, in what Sri Aurobindo calls the overmental worlds, you will find a concrete reality absolutely independent of your personal experience. You go back there and again find the same things with the differences that have occurred during your absence. So things are happening there, you go away, you come back, well, everything is what was with those differences which have happened. And you have relations with those beings that are identical with the relations you have with physical beings. With this difference that the relation is more plastic, supple, and direct. For example, there is the capacity to change the external form, the visible form, according to the inner state you are in. So obviously on the lower levels this is so easy, whatever you wish to be, you simply shape, become, inform. But on that level much more, there it is according to the inner state, your form is different. But because things are much more intimately held in those higher planes, there can be no deception. In the lower plane, form is not bound to consciousness. In the physical world, form can be totally different from consciousness, but it's rigid. In the subtler worlds close to the physical, form no more bound, is plastic, no more rigid. You can will it to become anything. You can change your form to appear as anything. I believe this is what had happened with that Rameshwaran Panditji from Rameshwaram. At some point he came to the mother and with the taking on an occult form of Sri Aurobindo, and she thought that was not in good taste. I'm sorry, I'm putting this on record, I hope, because otherwise the specifics may fade out from public knowledge. There are things like this which are taught in various occult ceremonies where they take on the form of certain diviner or occult beings in the subtle form or in imagination or other ways, for purpose of ceremony, as if to embody those truths on the material world. And there are various things taught like that in occult systems. They have their role, I suppose. But in this case, what he did was kind of pretentious and in bad taste. It would rather be much more useful when one approaches the mother to bear yourself of all preconceived self-formations and just be what you truly are, as deeply true, close to the psychic being, like a child to her. And that's it. No pretenses, no veils, no appearances. But on the lower levels, anyone can imitate any form. So there is no guarantee. As you go higher up, though, the form is expressive of your consciousness. So she's speaking specifically of the overmental worlds, and so she says you can change external form according to the inner state that you are in. But you can change your inner state and thereby change the form. But, she says, you can make an appointment with someone and be at the appointed place and find the same being again, with certain differences that have come about during your absence. It is entirely concrete, with results entirely concrete. One must have at least a little of this experience in order to understand these things. Otherwise, those who are convinced that all this is mere human imagination and mental formation, who believe that these gods have such and such form because men have thought them to be like that, and that they have certain defects and certain qualities because men have thought them to be like that. All those who say God is made in the image of man and that he exists only in human thought, all these will not understand. To them, this will appear absolutely ridiculous madness. That's why she says, one must have lived a little, touched the subject a little, to know how very concrete the thing is. Now, this is all part of the text because someone asked the question about these gods. I'm going to skip portions relating to the gods and come more to the specifics of the worlds and the out-of-body experience. And she says, naturally, children know a good deal if they have not been spoilt. When these faculties are not spoilt with age, you can keep them with you. And she says, children return at night to the very same place in the dream state where they were last in the previous. And she says, at a time when I was especially interested in dreams, I could return exactly to a place and continue a work that I had begun. Supervise something, for example, set something in order, a work of organization or of discovery, of exploration. You go until you reach a certain spot as you would in life, then you take a rest, then you return and begin again. You begin the work at the place where you left off and you continue it. And you perceive that there are things which are quite independent of you. Those of you who want, we can study the whole text in detail. I will skip to get to something important. You can, she says, create a mental image of these things and actually create a formation of a world. But there's a real world and then there's a formation of a world, and you can experience the two. And she says, so you must study both the dream and the occult reality in order to see what is the essential difference between the two. The one depends upon us and the other exists in itself, entirely independent of the thought that we have of it. When you have worked in that domain, you recognize in fact that once a subject has been studied and something has been learnt mentally, it gives a special color to the experience. The experience may be quite spontaneous and sincere, but the simple fact that the subject was known and studied lends a particular quality. Whereas if you had learnt nothing about the subject, if you knew nothing at all, the transcription would be completely spontaneous and sincere when the experience came. It would be more or less adequate, but it would not be the outcome of a previous mental formation. Now again, I'm going to take a break from this and digress to a point very important, because I've been referring frequently to Mark O'Byrne and his experiences. And one of the special features of his experiences, which we see all the way as narrated in his book also, is that he learnt nothing from any book, from any external source. All that came was either directly by his experience or by some prior facility held in memory of the inner being, which allowed him to re-enter those experiences and build on them. So the result is everything he speaks of comes from an authentic experience, not by a mix which comes from a prior expectation. In fact, he describes how he would have expected something and found things to be completely different. So the first time he sees this angelic being like a cherub floating around, he says, oh, someone has created a mental formation and sent it to fool me. And he tries to dissolve it. And it doesn't dissolve again and again. And finally it communicates with him. And that's when he realized there are actually beings like that who exist in those worlds. And it's a shock for him that actually these things are not imaginations. So many such interesting things. Why I'm highlighting this? Because many people ask, why doesn't he read more, maybe finding help from Sri Aurobindo and him other? Yes, he has read a little bit where it helps. But instinctively, he blocks out any attempt to read or follow other people's experience so that his own experience may be authentic. And this seems to be a choice made by the soul for this life. While confirming things the hard way, it's as if the soul has chosen, it will find in its own way and authentically project and share with humanity whatever he can without such mixture. And there's a reason for that. But you must understand why he's rigidly against reading or following anything else, and he will only limit himself to his own experience, and he will say, I, very strong word, don't care for other people's opinions, nor mine. I don't care for my own opinions, he will say. Finally, what matters is the experience. So it has a certain place, and I suppose that's part of the mission that his soul has chosen for this life. One of the things, of course, it does is it makes him hard, rigidly reactive against anything imposed artificially from outside. And some people have asked questions, well, why is he like that? But that's part of the mission and the purpose in this life. But it's very, very important to recognize this, that as a result, he has had to go a long way. We were in a conversation and then suddenly he commented, you're talking of things that I took years to realize and discover. Except I'm talking of it from my reading of Sri Aurobindo's and the Mother, and perhaps some very limited glimpses of experiences. But he's come to that same conclusion on his own, and that's valuable. It gives it a certain authenticity and a certain power, which is part of the work that he has to do in this life. So I'm just putting this in a certain context. And so she says, naturally this occult knowledge is not very frequent in the world, because in those who do not have a developed inner life, there are veritable gaps between the external consciousness and the inmost consciousness. Now we are coming to something extremely important for the practice, both spiritual, occult, as well as for any OBE type experience. This occult knowledge or this experience is not very frequent in the world. Yes, it does exist, but not very common. Because in those who do not have a developed inner life, there are veritable gaps. Those who do have a developed inner life, the gaps are less. So understand this distinction, look at your own life. Observe how much time you give to develop the inner life, how much time you spend to develop your outer life, and then make choices. There are veritable gaps between the external consciousness and the inmost consciousness. The inmost, we will say, will be the soul, the psychic being. So now there is from your external to the inmost, let's say, a continuity of gradations of consciousness. And being a continuity, you can say between any two there will be any number. So it's almost as if an infinity of ranges. Of course, you could make categories, but that's a question of how you categorize. There's a continuum. In terms of gradations available of consciousness, there's a continuum. In terms of gradations of consciousness developed within you, there are huge gaps. So, she says, the linking states of being are missing and they have to be constructed. So, let's say you are in your physical gradation and there is some inner layer corresponding to some emotional, deeper emotional state. From this physical grade to that emotional grade, there are gaps. So you find yourself suddenly thrown into that emotional state and then thrown out. But when in that, you're unable to be stable in your outer grade, unable to be coherent in your outer expression, as when you're angry, passionate, upset, whatever, there's a lack of continuity. If the continuity is formed, you will find that from that state of extreme, whatever, passion, anger, distress, excitement, you can still communicate with clarity. Let's say you just had a strong, shocking experience. It pushed you inward, it shook you up, and then you, I don't know how to, I don't know what. Suddenly you're babbling like an immature, unformed, incapable, incoherent person. Why? Because there's a gap between these two. And I'm giving an example of something very superficial, ordinary, and common of a daily experience. Just it pushed you into a state of emotion and distress. There are others, they get upset, they get angry, or in that state they will, with clarity, with force, articulate themselves without losing this continuity. And that means there's a continuity build up there. If this is true of an inward movement, it is equally true of an upward movement. I remember my strange example, but my grandfather had a certain opening. He was, as he recalled it, a yogi in intense tapasya. At some stage, he was as if drawn out from his cave-like space and saw a beautiful possibility in a mansion with beautiful music. So he took birth in this life to experience that before going back to his tapasya. Something like that he had as a dream vision once. So he had unusual abilities which came spontaneously from his childhood. He was very intuitive, very perceptive. He had a power of intellect which was quite unusual in that he could form the horoscope just looking at the time. He could look at a person and describe what were your ascending signs and form the horoscope. Sometimes without needing a horoscope, he would get an intuition. It would be spot on. He would say it and it would form and things like that. So something unusual there, which came from a prior life of deep sadhana. In this life, it was a different training. What happened is, when I first met him in childhood, and apparently this would happen to him, he would suddenly go into a certain state, and the whole body would become somewhat rigid, and he would be thrown into a deeper state. And I've seen this happen once. So he would be in this state, and he would perceive things, sometimes the future, articulate, etc. But the body itself would be as if in a unbalanced state. Gap. In this life, those layers were not bridged. Had they been bridged, he would have been with full focus here, shift into that inner state, access that knowledge, and either bring it back or from that poise of access articulate what he was perceiving. Without this reaction which was destabilizing the surface consciousness. And I'm giving this as an example because you might see many people getting into unbalanced states, sometimes even accessing very low grade powers or means. But the moment you see this imbalance, you know there's a gap. Something is missing in continuity. And it does not matter. You can go to some very low, superficial inner ranges, but still have this gap. And this shows you how much actually is missing in terms of linking states. So the linking states of being are missing, and they have to be constructed. So, Mother says, when people enter there for the first time, they are bewildered. They have the impression they've fallen into the night, into nothingness, into non-being. So what happens? Normally you close your eyes, you go into some state, I don't know, it's just all black darkness, I don't know where I am. And then of course you say, maybe I'm asleep. And either you go to sleep or you say, I think I'm asleep, I come out, well, there was no spiritual experience. Yes, obviously, but you did go in a little bit. You could continue to go deeper and deeper and deeper. And if you did that, you could actually enter very quickly a state where you might feel as if, I don't even know where is the universe. There is no universe. I'm just as if floating in some sheer blankness. If you did that through the mental awareness rather than through a more intermediate vital mental range, which would be the way for the direct or closer contact with the psychic. You could even go through a mental awareness, and you'd be in that kind of a blankness. Nothing exists, as if. And I've heard this from a very senior monk of a lineage in Buddhism who said, and I think that was nirvana. Not quite, but it would be certainly a good starting point to go into something which would be the real sense of the nirvana in the Buddhism. But certainly it's a, let's say, first glimpse of a reflection of the nirvana in the mental consciousness. But still, what does it describe by? A complete loss of references. How useful? The capacity to go in is what you're building at that moment. But so you see how much of a gap exists. They've fallen into the night, into nothingness, into non-being. Or so it feels. Then she continues, and she gives an example. I had a Danish friend, a painter, who was like that. He wanted me to teach him how to go out of the body. We're coming to our subject now. He used to have interesting dreams and thought that it would be worth the trouble to go there consciously. So here is the link now between the dream experience and the outer body experience. She is relating to this. You go to the dream, you have an interesting dream, you come back with a recall. The capacity to recall is important. It would be worth the trouble to go there consciously. So you could either do that by willing yourself to go to the dream, or you could go into that domain or that grade of consciousness in which the dream took place through an outer body state or even a deep inward concentration in meditation. So he wanted to do that. So he comes to the mother and says, I would like to have this. So what does mother do? Her description. So I made him, quote, go out. And it was a frightful thing. When he was dreaming, a part of his mind still remained conscious, active, and a kind of link existed between this active part and his external being. Then he remembered some of his dreams, but it was a very partial phenomenon. But to go out of one's body means to pass gradually through all the states of being, if one does the thing systematically. Well, already in the subtle physical, one is almost de-individualized. And when one goes farther, there remains nothing, for nothing is formed or individualized. So what happened to him? It was a frightful thing for him. I give another example of somebody that mother took out in this way. And this was Pranab Da, who was the head of the physical education program in the ashram. And he narrated to us how at some point the mother told him that I will teach you occultism. So he said, okay, he's mother's attendant. This must be in the 60s. So he's waiting, and mother is busy, and she's busy, and she's busy. And finally, when she gets free, it's past midnight, and he's getting really, really sleepy. So mother said, okay, she has all the energy. She says, okay, now we'll teach you occultism. So I'll teach you first how to go out of the body. So this man is already half asleep. And mother says, okay. And now he didn't tell us details. I asked him afterwards, what did she make you do? Did she ask you to do something? He said, no, I just lay down and then she took me out of the body. And he's out of the body, and then he says, there was this strange camel-like shaped being, a creature there, and it had all kinds of sharp needles, and it was poking me all over, and I was feeling so horrible. And I said, Mother, enough, take me out. So she brings him back. And then the next day, she wanted to do more. I says, Mother, I'm very tired, I'm very sleepy. Can you do it so that whenever I need, I will have the capacity? And now I don't need to study and work on it. Mother said, all right. And she left it at that. So she gave him the, let's say, blessing or the gift that whenever he needed, he would have access to that experience, but that was it. I don't know if he ever had, whether he took interest. That's not important here. But what is important is that for her it was as easy as this. So I made him go out. With Pranabda, it was not as frightful a thing, though he still spoke of it with great distress, because his vital was much more individualized. What was missing in the Danish painter was this lack of individuality and lack of the intermediate levels. So mother's observation is very important, and you must pay attention to this when she says, to go out of one's body means to pass gradually through all the states of the being. So let's say you're going out, finally out of body experiences primarily take place in the vital body. From your physical body, you shift your consciousness into your vital body, so to say. Or you remain conscious in the vital body in exclusion of the physical. Let the physical go to sleep and then you're in the vital. Effectively, that's what it would be to go out of the body. Or you could do similar with in the mental body. But still, the point is then you would need to be able to shift your consciousness to that level at which you want to go out. So even the vital body is not just one thin layer, it is a continuum. We'll come to this shortly when we read one of Sri Aurobindo's texts. There's a continuum in the vital, it as if blends downwards all the way to the physical and blends upwards to the mental. So which grade of the vital would you normally be aware in the vital body, depending on how formed your vital body is, how individualized, how organized, how much the continuity of layers is built up, and that would give you access freely to operate on all those ranges or move across them. If not developed, you would have experiences and capacities which in time perhaps you would develop and learn to. And that would be a way of developing while out of the body. But you could also develop while in the body, or with a spiritual focus, develop continuity of consciousness across these layers, and you would have that capacity as well as the benefit in the waking consciousness. So I'm trying to put all this in context so that it's useful for everyone, irrespective of whether you are working to have an out-of-body experience or not. Build this continuum through all the states of awareness. And then she says, if one does the thing systematically. Now you can do it non-systematically, and this will be the method we will discuss when we come to the having an out-of-body experience. And there you don't need to follow this systematic process. There, for example, one of the methods we will use, which is to put the body in a certain state of rest, go to sleep, wake up in the middle by an alarm at 3 o'clock, is the method recommended by Mark. You wake up fully, go right back to sleep now with the intention that when you wake up next, you will make an effort as if to drift off. So the idea is you put your body, you woke it up, now you let it go back to sleep, it will go into deep sleep, deep relaxation, but your consciousness has been sufficiently awakened that it would wake up in between, your body would still be asleep, and then in the early part of the morning, when the glue which links you is most free, you will be able to simply drift off. So this would be the method of doing it non-systematically by using a technique. And technique is simple enough that in principle anybody could have such an experience. But the disadvantage of the technique would be that you cannot just say, okay, I'm going to lie down and go out of my body. Which you will see in Mother's example. She says at some point she was on the ship in the journeying, and in the Mediterranean, or there was a huge storm. And Theon told her, go and stop the storm. So she goes down into her room, lies down on her bed, goes out of the body, sees this huge chaos of beings dancing around, infuses peace on them, brings them to calm, comes back to her body, wakes up in the body, comes back to the deck of the ship, the storm has gone, clear skies. This ability to go out at will, engage with something and come back, would be yours if you did this work in a systematic way by building the continuity. In that case, you'll be able to shift to that level, whatever level it is you choose to exteriorize in, and then consciously disengage and step out, literally. But you may choose to use a non-systematic way, in which case you would still find the ability to go out by such means and then have an experience. And over time, over days, weeks, months, years of having such experiences, you will find in the effort to integrate the memory on return, you are building as if the continuity of consciousness. Maybe partially, maybe not to the level of mastery that you can come out on any level, but at least you built a continuity that at some point, a year or two down, you may find you can relax your physical body, put yourself back in that familiar state, and then be able to float off, separate from the physical. Because you'll have built continuity. So I'm just pointing out there's a whole variation of ways in which one could build and develop the capacity. So we come back to Mother's text. To go out of one's body means to pass gradually through all the states of being if one does the thing systematically. Well, already in the subtle physical, one is almost de-individualized, and when one goes farther, there remains nothing, for nothing is formed or individualized. So if your vital body, if your consciousness of the vital, mental or other layers is sufficiently individualized in those layers, certainly the ability to register experiences in dream state, recall and retain, or act on those states, or even open to influences, feel things happening on those gradations, or put out consciously a will on the vital or mental planes for specific outcomes. All these would become easy. And then, of course, if sufficiently individualized, you could be able to project partially or go out of body fully. In any case, from a spiritual perspective, to build this continuity is essential. For you want your outer layers to become a vehicle for your inner layers and their potential, ideally all the way to the psychic being, which should be now the true center of your being, the leader of your consciousness, the decision maker for everything. But the psychic being cannot act on the physical body directly. It is too rigid, too dark, too narrow, too suffocating for its free action. The closest it can get to is to the subtle physical, which is plastic enough, large enough that it can rest and act through it. But still, for it to be able to express fully its creative potential, you would want the vital bodies, gradations of the vital and the mental, to also be sufficiently awakened and conscious and influenced by the psychic, psychicized, as we will say, that they can become useful vehicles for the psychic influence. Otherwise, as happens for many people, even when the psychic influence is strong, when the psychic being is awake, its ability to intervene on the surface life is very limited and narrow and very occasional, sporadic. Little bursts popping out here and there, or in some specialized activity where that link has been formed. As for example, an artist who's painting and then the psychic influence comes strongly because you're in this altered state of deep immersion in the art creative state, which is somewhere in between the vital mental range. That layer has opened to the psychic. You're now able to put out your beautiful art. You come out of that state, there's no link from that state to your normal surface daily life, and you become this grouchy, nasty, petty person. You shift back into your art state, you're this wonderful, creative, maybe joyous, maybe even wide and loving person. You come back again, no link. You snap back to this very narrow little person. It represents a gap. Wouldn't you want this beauty of the artistic state to be fully ingrained all the way to the most material, that every gesture in life, every act, every thought, every feeling would be expressive of the same beauty that you're able to create in your paintings? For that you need to build this continuity of consciousness. Well, and if you want the art to come from the psychic, and you want every gesture and thought and emotion and feeling and action to be an expression of the psychic, well, for that you need to build this continuity. So even if you're not interested in an out-of-body state or having this kind of an occult development, this integration would be essential for the integral yoga and the spiritual life and the goals of this integral yoga. So I'm coming back to the text now with completing this clarification and digression. In the subtle physical, one is de-individualized. When one goes farther, there remains nothing, for nothing is formed or individualized. Thus, when people are asked to meditate or told to go within, to enter into themselves, they are in agony naturally. They have the impression that they are vanishing, and with reason. There is nothing, no consciousness. She comes back to the theme of the gods. She speaks of how the human being has the psychic being which gives a specific characteristic. As a result, they have a potential to grow much more than even the gods. Maybe I'll just complete with this because it's worth understanding this distinction for us, although it goes beyond the scope of what we want to cover today. In the gods, I'll go back. It must be said that all those beings who have never had an earthly existence, gods or demons, invisible beings and powers, do not possess what the divine has put into man, the psychic being. That this psychic being gives to man true love, charity, compassion, a deep kindness which compensate for all his external defects. In the gods, there is no fault because they live according to their own nature, spontaneously and without constraint. As gods, it is their manner of being. But if you take a higher point of view, let's digress again. You see, in animals in the forest, without the human mind intervening, there is this spontaneity. They live according to their nature. Above, the gods live spontaneously according to their diviner nature. In between is this human with the intellect which makes self-aware but cuts off from the instinct from below or the higher spiritual intuition or the divine will from above. Here you're lost with an individual will which is completely disconnected and now falsified. So that's our problem. But the potential is what she's looking at now. But if you take a higher point of view, if you have a higher vision, a vision of the whole, you see that they, the gods, lack certain qualities that are exclusively human. By his capacity of love and self-giving, man can have as much power as the gods and even more. When he is not egoistic, when he has surmounted his egoism. It doesn't mean we are superior. We have the potential, when we surmount the egoism, to do something far greater. So, if he fulfills the required condition, man is nearer to the supreme than the gods. Now be very careful about this or this kind of statement, because many people take only the last part. Man is nearer to the supreme than the gods. No, if he fulfills the required condition, then he is. He can be nearer. He is not so automatically, but he has the power to be so, the potentiality. These are mother's words. If human love manifested itself without mixture, it would be all-powerful. Unfortunately, in human love, there is as much love of oneself as of the one loved. It is not a love that makes you forget yourself. So, it's not all-powerful. But what she's saying here is there is something which comes from the psychic presence, which, if allowed to fully flow, and in a vehicle which is integrated with the continuum of layers developed, individualized, made conscious and instrumental to the psychic, and thence to the divine will, then what is possible in the capacity of love and self-giving, man can have as much power as the gods and even more. So, that's the direction of the fulfillment for which this struggle and this loss that we are going through now in our evolution is worthwhile. Because if we do not sufficiently disconnect from the animal tracts of our evolution, we cannot prepare for something higher. But in order to prepare for something higher, in disconnecting from the natural spontaneity of the animal life, we have lost the spontaneity, but we have not yet gained the divine spontaneity, and so we are confused and lost in between. And our choice is then to rapidly connect to the deeper and higher. Okay, so this is the text I wanted to first take up. It gives immediately an idea of what is involved in an out-of-body experience. But it also shows you how easy it was for the mother to give it to you. So I made him go out. But it was a frightful thing because in him those links had not been developed. So here's an important reference. If you want to do it well, if you want mastery and not just a few glimpses out of of out-of-body experience will work on this integration. Meanwhile, you can have your glimpses also, but and you will. All of us should at some point or other in our life. It is worth it as an experience. But having had that, one can either choose while out of the body to build this integration and extend it while in the body, or work while in the body and extend it while out of the body and perfect it there perhaps. But we understand that there's a wide spectrum of possibilities in our evolution, and according to one's nature, sometimes according to the choice made of the inner being, also one may choose to choose which direction one develops. But here we get a deeper understanding of the process and the requirement. I'll take a quick look at chat box, otherwise we have mostly finished our time. Okay. Geminus has some interesting observations which I will read from. Those of you who are interested, he has very interesting observations, but he says that my dog would sit and meditate with me. Yes, this is true of many of these beings when they're preparing for the human life, but have also sufficiently developed spiritual individuality. Then they cherish being with a human being who has a spiritual consciousness, because it helps them also in their evolution. Okay, there are many other questions relating to practice which I will club together for another time. Right now I just want to touch upon these texts. Geminus observes all real human communication is soul to soul, and is the same with animals too. And he says, to strengthen the subtle physical, correctly practice Sraddhalu's descent of peace meditation 3 times a day. I didn't say that, somebody said that. And Geminus's value, words you can take with for greater value, because Geminus has these out-of-body experiences very frequently, and he has taught others also. And he spoke in the conference that Mark had in Mark's program. All of this will come on the video, which we will put up shortly. But this is a useful observation, because in this descent of peace, we find a certain density of substance which is built up in the body, in the subtle body. So he's commenting further, once you become adept in the descent of peace concentration, and when fully concentrated, do the descent in a very speedy manner, up and down about 30 times head to toe. This is velo. And that will help to build that vibratory state in which the subtle body can separate from the physical. He says also conscious OBE is a very supportive aspect of spiritual development. So this point I will again highlight, conscious OBE as distinct from, well, occasionally you find yourself out, which is not so conscious always, or you have a state which is half sleep dream experience which was a partial projection, you come back and then you're not too sure, which is not a full OBE. Okay, so there are many other important questions regarding the practice which we will take up later. I just want to close with this for those of you who want to do this and take this up in a serious way, to build the continuity of layers of consciousness. There are 2 directions, horizontal, inward, towards the soul, towards your psychic being, until you have actually the direct experience of the presence of the psychic being, which right now is only an influence. Whatever your experience of the psychic, assume right now it's only an influence. There are people who have a strong influence and then they say, I have realized my psychic. No, you have not. You just have a strong influence. Realized means when you actually experience directly the thing in itself, the way it knows itself. And that's a completely different experience. After that, you're no more the same person. Even if you don't live in it, you'll no more be the same person. So, but build the capacity to go within, to go deeper, and stay, and then integrate outward. I've repeated this many times the last few sessions. But the same process can also happen in an upward movement, with your consciousness opening, literally as if drifting, rising up, settling above head, and from above head opening to still higher regions. Don't worry if you do not get a distinct experience. You'll find yourself in a grade which is finer, higher, wider, freer. Whatever it is you are able to access, stay in it and integrate, build the continuity. So this would be a base even in the integral yoga for integrating these layers of consciousness which are still us, or belong to us, or which should belong to us more completely. Observe also in your daily activities how your state shifts. Oh, just now I got emotionally very upset. How did you come back? Could you consciously bring yourself back to your so-called normal state, or still higher state? Why not? Could you bring yourself consciously back in a continuum? Or, as many people do, I'm so angry, I need to de-stress. So they go and do something which makes them forget till they snap back and fall into old state. Then you have a gap. Shift consciously. Can you do that? If you can shift consciously, one of the interesting things would be, from that state, you will come to your whatever normal, and then you should be able to slide straight back to that state of distress, anger, or whatever the situation was. Then you have a continuity. Otherwise, you don't have a continuity. There are gaps. Even if you think you came back in a smooth way, if you can't go back in a smooth way, you jumped gaps. You're just not conscious of it. If you can shift to whatever state you want and then go right back and go back and forth, yes, now you have a continuity. Now I'm just not just emotional states, mental states. You have a state of intense clarity of awareness in thought, as when you are possibly doing a presentation or writing something or doing wonderful painting or writing an essay, doing your studies, doing some research, highly intellectualized, where even you're not conscious of your physical body. From that state you come back and momentarily you're not sure where you are. To that extent you might have gone. But then can you come back to your whatever normal state is and then go right back and be in that and come right back? If you can, then you've built continuity. If you can't, you're missing gap, and there are gaps. Build the capacity so that you should be able to slide right back to the point where you may be physically extremely tired. You say, I am exhausted, I cannot even think. But the work requires it. Shift yourself, bring yourself to that state, stabilize in it, do the work, and then come back to rest at whatever layer you are at. Build this continuity, build this capacity. It's not difficult. It just means you have to pay attention and then make the exercise of moving between states. You'll find very quickly, sometimes within days, you're able to slide from one state to another. And the result will be you will no more be bound by that state. One of the problems people have when they get angry is, I'm completely lost and I'm unable to control myself. I'm unable to get back to any degree or semblance of self-control because you're stuck in a pocket. When you have built continuity, from that state you will immediately be able to come to, or when you choose to, come to state of normalcy. And the anger will just fade out. Or you can get back into it if you want, but you will be able to simply consciously shift back, and that's it. At no point will you have lost control. If you have lost control, observe there's a gap you crossed. Build the gap now. Build the continuity. So there's an exercise one can do. It's not exactly the best thing to try, but for those who want, consciously shift states. Consciously bring yourself into that state of anger. Even if it is a pale imitation of the real anger, get as close as you can to that. Observe what it's like and then come right back. So you're building a continuity. The next time this situation of life kicks you into an anger state, you'll say, but I don't want to be in this state. You will shift consciously. Slide to whatever state you need to be at for purpose of exercising force on a situation, and then shift back straight without any part of you disturbed. Observe, play with this, but understand the underlying principle that there are large gaps. And we reread from the mother. In those who do not have a developed inner life, there are veritable gaps between the external consciousness and the inmost consciousness. The linking states of being are missing and they have to be constructed. To go out of one's body means to pass gradually through all states of being if one does the thing systematically. So, for those who do not have a developed inner life, and in this way, by working on this, we will also have a developed inner life, or we will develop our inner life more and more. The easiest, remember, from the spiritual method will be go as deep as you can to the inner or higher, to whatever is your poise. Stay in it, open to the divine influence, presence, wideness, peace, and from there gently bring it all the way to the most surface parts in a continuity. Passing through each of these layers, infusing that peace, infusing that light, infusing the presence. Feeling in each of them the opening and the turning to the divine in aspiration. Layer by layer, part by part, as you return, all the way to the most material, physical, surface awareness. And then swing right back layer by layer by layer if you can. Or go as deep as you can again, layer by layer, opening each layer to the divine, relating to the Divine Mother, opening to her wideness, her peace, her light, her presence, her love, layer by layer, all the way. This would be the direct spiritual method. And to wherever you have gone, as deep as you can, from there you build in this way. On the return, you'll feel in within you as if all the layers within which you are not conscious of, or you were not conscious of, as if now lit up, filled, full, and opened. It's a feeling of fullness across layers, which is quite amazing. It doesn't stay, it fades because it's not yet stabilized. But you will have that experience and you will know what it's like to be a more completely integrated person. And in these parts which have opened even momentarily, something descends and she forms in you all these layers and builds the continuity and bridges of consciousness. This is the most rapid way. And because she infuses, because she gives, she builds, it's done with a capacity in which literally the work of years or sometimes of lives of development can be compressed in a very short time. And this is without exaggeration. So recognize the principle of what needs to be done, understand the occult process, which also you should practice because your effort will make a difference. But then rely more on the spiritual process, which is much more direct, much more rapid and complete. So let's take this as a focus of and form of practice in our aspiration in the coming week. For those of you who are so inclined, so interested, dedicate time. Don't wait for it to happen. Don't wait for meditation to just come upon you. When it does come, wonderful. When it does not, fix a time, sit and make this effort. And where you feel helpful, use that guided meditation for descent of peace. The first time you do it with that process helping you, and the second time you can do it without it, following directly the experience, and then let the experience carry you more and more. Let's concentrate on this intention, in this aspiration, because we want to achieve all this in this life, or as much as we can in this life. We don't want to wait for the next. We should not have to start all over again for these things. We have spent so many years to bring us where we are. From this point on, it should be faster, it should be more rapid. And we must achieve all that we can in this very incarnation. With the Divine Mother's help, everything becomes possible.